The fluorescent lights of Westdale Mall cast long shadows across the parking lot that December night, their artificial glow mixing with fresh snowfall to create an almost ethereal scene. Inside a tan and green 1972 Buick Electra, Christmas music still played softly on the radio, a haunting soundtrack to unspeakable horror. The car's windows had begun to frost over, nature's curtain slowly concealing what lay within. 18-year-old Michelle Martinko, dressed in her black jersey dress and fur coat, slumped in the driver's seat, her life stolen just hours after she'd been singing carols with her choir friends. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a frozen moment in time that would torment a family, haunt a community, and challenge investigators for nearly 4 decades. The Christmas lights twinkling in the mall windows behind the car seemed to mock the darkness of what had occurred, a stark reminder of how quickly normalcy can shatter into nightmare. This is Cold Case Grim Files, and you're welcome to our growing family of lovers of justice and a world free from animals in human form. Before we journey through this heartbreaking story of loss, persistence, and ultimate justice, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if stories of cold cases finally solved give you hope that justice can prevail, hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more cases where determination won over despair. Cedar Rapids, Iowa, October 1961. For Albert and Janet Martinko, the arrival of Michelle Marie felt like a divine answer to years of prayers and heartbreak. After suffering through 5 devastating miscarriages following the birth of their first daughter, Janelle, Janet had begun to wonder if she would ever hold another child. When Michelle arrived that October, wrapped in a hospital blanket and wailing with the robust lungs of a healthy newborn, both parents wept tears of gratitude. "She was our miracle," Janet would later tell friends, her eyes soft with the memory. After so much loss, Michelle felt like proof that God hadn't forgotten us. The Martinko household in Cedar Rapids was modest, but filled with warmth. Albert worked long hours to provide for his family, his calloused hands evidence of his dedication. Janet was the heart of the home, ensuring her daughters knew they were cherished. Janelle, 7 years Michelle's senior, took her role as big sister seriously, often braiding Michelle's blonde hair and reading her bedtime stories. But Michelle's childhood wasn't without its challenges. At 12, during a routine school screening, doctors discovered she had scoliosis, a curvature of the spine that, if left untreated, could cause serious problems. The solution was a rigid metal brace that Michelle would have to wear for years. "I remember how she cried the first time they fitted it," Janelle recalled decades later, her voice catching. "It was this awful contraption that made her feel like a robot. She was so self-conscious. The other kids would stare, and Michelle, who had always been so outgoing, started to withdraw." For 2 years, Michelle endured the brace, the awkward stares, and the feeling of being different. But at 14, when the doctors finally removed it, declaring her spine corrected, something remarkable happened. Michelle didn't just recover physically, she blossomed. She discovered a passion for fashion, spending hours arranging outfits and experimenting with makeup techniques she'd learned from magazines. Her blonde hair, which she learned to style in the feathered waves popular in the late 1970s, framed a face that had transformed from girlish to striking. Boys at Kennedy High School began to notice her, their heads turning as she walked down the hallways. Yet Michelle remained remarkably humble about her appearance. She genuinely had no idea how beautiful she was, one of her choir friends remembered. Guys would ask her out and she'd be genuinely surprised. She thought they were just being nice. What truly made Michelle shine wasn't her looks, but her spirit. She loved music, her voice rising clear and strong in the Kennedy Concert Choir. She twirled baton with grace and dedication, spending hours perfecting routines. She was the girl who remembered everyone's birthday, who would stay after school to help struggling classmates with math, who could make her mother laugh with spot-on impressions of their neighbors. For Janet, Michelle was more than a daughter. She was a best friend. They would sit together at the kitchen table late into the evening, Janet teaching Michelle to sew while they talked about everything from boys to dreams to the kind of woman Michelle hoped to become. Albert, gruff on the outside but tender-hearted within, would watch them from his armchair, newspaper forgotten in his lap, a small smile playing at his lips. "We thought we had time," Janet would later say, her voice barely above a whisper. "You always think you have more time." Wednesday, December 19, 1979, dawned cold and clear in Cedar Rapids. Michelle woke early, excited about the Kennedy Concert Choir's Christmas banquet that evening. She spent extra time getting ready, selecting a sleek black jersey dress that her mother had helped her pick out at Younker's department store. She paired it with a white and brown fur coat, not real fur, but convincing enough to make her feel grown up and elegant. "You look beautiful, honey," Janet said as Michelle twirled in the living room, modeling her outfit, "like you should be singing at Carnegie Hall instead of the school cafeteria." Michelle laughed, that bright, unself-conscious laugh that would echo in her family's memories for decades. "Mom, it's just a banquet. But I want to look nice. We're going to sing, and Principal Anderson is going to give us all certificates." The banquet was everything Michelle had hoped for. The school cafeteria had been transformed with red and green streamers and a towering Christmas tree. The tables were laden with casseroles, ham, and an array of desserts brought by proud parents. Michelle sat with her choir friends, their voices rising in harmony as they sang carols, Silent Night, O Holy Night, and Michelle's favorite, The First Noel. Her friend Tracy Price, who worked part-time at Westdale Mall, sat beside her. "You coming to the mall later?" Tracy asked between songs. "I'm working until closing. We could hang out for a bit." "Maybe," Michelle said. "I need to pick up this coat Mom put on layaway for me." After the banquet ended around 8:30 p.m., Michelle said goodbye to her friends and headed to the parking lot. She climbed into the family's distinctive tan and green 1972 Buick Electra, a boat of a car that her father loved and that Michelle sometimes complained was embarrassing to drive. But that night she was grateful for the car's reliable heater as the temperature had dropped into the low 20s. She drove the familiar route to Westdale Mall, the newly opened shopping center that had become the social hub for Cedar Rapids teenagers. The parking lot was still moderately full despite the late hour, last-minute Christmas shoppers rushing to find gifts before the holiday. Michelle parked and headed inside, her purse heavy with $186 in cash, money she'd saved from her part-time job, plus what her parents had given her for the coat. But as she wandered through the brightly lit corridors, passing store windows decorated with tinsel and Santa displays, she had second thoughts. The coat suddenly seemed less appealing than it had weeks ago. She'd seen another one at a different store that she liked better. Why spend all that money tonight? Christmas was just days away. She could wait, maybe ask for something else entirely. She ran into Tracy at the jewelry store where she worked. "You get your coat?" Tracy asked. "Nah, changed my mind," Michelle said with a shrug. "I'm going to look around a bit more." She also bumped into Keith K.T. Thomas, another friend, near the food court. They chatted about the banquet, about Christmas plans, about nothing in particular, the kind of easy conversation that teenagers have when time seems infinite and tomorrow is always guaranteed. Around 9:30 p.m., KT walked Michelle toward the exit. "See you later, Michelle," he said, waving as she pushed through the glass doors into the biting winter air. "Bye, KT," she called back, her breath forming clouds in the cold. Those would be the last words anyone who loved her would ever hear her speak. Michelle walked across the dark parking lot, her heels clicking on the pavement, her coat pulled tight against the wind. She reached the Buick, likely relieved to see it waiting where she'd left it. She unlocked the driver's side door and slid into the seat, placing her purse on the passenger side. What happened next would haunt investigators for decades. Somewhere in that parking lot, someone had been watching her. Someone had been waiting. Someone who had come prepared with rubber gloves and a knife, ready to destroy a life without mercy or reason. The phone call that shattered everything. Back at the Martinko home, Janet moved through her evening routine, putting away the dinner dishes and setting out ingredients for breakfast. Michelle had mentioned she'd be home before midnight. Responsible as always, she knew her mother worried if she was out too late. When 11 p.m. came and went, Janet glanced at the clock but didn't panic. Maybe Michelle had run into more friends. Maybe she'd decided to see a movie. At 11:30, Janet started pacing between the living room and the window, peering out at the empty street. Midnight arrived. Then 12:30 a.m. The anxiety that had been a small knot in Janet's stomach began to spread, cold and sharp. "Albert," she said, shaking her husband awake, "Michelle isn't home." Albert sat up, instantly alert with that parental instinct that knows when something is wrong. "Did you try calling her friends?" "There's no answer at Tracy's house. Where could she be?" They waited another agonizing hour, each minute stretching into eternity. At 2 a.m., Albert could wait no longer. His hands shook as he dialed the Cedar Rapids Police Department. "My daughter hasn't come home," he told the dispatcher, his voice rough with fear. "Michelle Martinko. She's 18. She left for a choir banquet this afternoon and should have been home hours ago. This isn't like her. Something's wrong. I know something's wrong." The dispatcher took down the information, assuring Albert that patrol units would begin searching. But Albert couldn't sit still. He grabbed his coat and car keys, ignoring Janet's pleas to stay home by the phone. "I have to look for her," he said, his eyes red-rimmed. "I have to find my baby girl." He drove through the empty streets of Cedar Rapids, searching every parking lot, every side street, looking for that tan and green Buick. He checked the mall parking lot, but in the darkness, missed the car that held his daughter's body. Back home, Janet sat curled in Michelle's favorite chair, clutching one of her daughter's sweaters, praying harder than she'd ever prayed in her life. "Please, God," she whispered, "please let her be okay. Please bring her home safe." At 4 a.m., a patrol car rolled slowly through Westdale Mall's parking lot on routine patrol. Officer David Doherty's flashlight beam swept across the nearly empty lot, then stopped on the large Buick Electra, sitting alone near the northwest entrance. "Dispatch. I've got a vehicle matching the description," he radioed. "Tan and green Buick. License plate matches. I'm going to check it out." He approached cautiously, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. As the light hit the frosted windows, he could make out a figure slumped in the driver's seat. "Hello? Miss? Are you okay?" he called, tapping on the window. No response. Officer Doherty tried the door handle, locked. He moved his flashlight beam closer to the window, wiping away a thin layer of frost with his glove. What he saw made him stumble backward, his breath catching in his throat. "Dispatch," he said, his voice steady despite the horror he'd just witnessed. "I need backup immediately. And call Detective Harvey. We've got a homicide." The knock came at exactly 5:30 a.m. Albert, who had returned home only an hour earlier, his search fruitless, opened the door to find two police officers standing on his porch, their faces grave. "Mr. Martinko," the senior officer said, "I'm Detective Harvey Denninger. May we come in? We need to speak with you privately." The word privately sent ice through Albert's veins. Upstairs, Janet had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep. Albert led the officers into the living room, his legs suddenly unsteady. "It's Michelle, isn't it?" Albert whispered. Detective Denninger nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Martinko. We found your daughter's car at Westdale Mall. Michelle, she's deceased. I'm so very sorry." Albert's knees buckled. He caught himself on the armchair, his face crumbling. No, no, that can't be right. Not my Michelle, not our miracle. I know this is devastating, Denninger continued gently. But I need to ask you some questions. Given the condition, the nature of the scene, we need to understand Michelle's activities, who she knew, anyone who might have. He stopped, his words drowned out by a sound that would haunt everyone in that room for the rest of their lives. From upstairs came a scream, not of surprise or fear, but of pure, primal agony. Janet had been awakened by the rhythmic pulse of red and blue police lights filtering through the bedroom curtains. With a mother's terrible intuition, she knew. She appeared at the top of the stairs, her face white, her hands gripping the banister so hard her knuckles were bone white. Is she— Janet couldn't finish the sentence. Albert climbed the stairs, gathering his wife in his arms as she collapsed. Her body racked with sobs so violent they seemed to tear her apart from the inside. I need to see her, Janet gasped between sobs. Take me to Michelle. Take me to my baby right now. Detective Denninger climbed the stairs, his own eyes wet. Mrs. Martinko, I'm so sorry, but we can't do that. The mall is a crime scene. No one can go in. We need to preserve evidence so we can catch whoever did this. Evidence? Janet's voice rose to a shriek. That's my daughter. That's my baby. You can't leave her there alone. She must be so scared. She needs her mother. Janet, Albert said, his voice breaking. She's gone. Our Michelle is gone. The words seemed to drain the fight from her. Janet sank to the floor, her head in her hands rocking back and forth. When the officers gently tried to ask questions, trying to establish a timeline, gather information that might help catch the killer, Janet could only repeat the same words over and over. I never should have put that coat on layaway. This is my fault. If I hadn't put it on layaway, she wouldn't have gone to the mall. She'd be here. She'd be safe. This is my fault. No amount of reassurance could penetrate her guilt. In the days and weeks that followed, as the details emerged, the 29 stab wounds, the savagery of the attack, the fact that Michelle had fought so hard, Janet's self-blame only deepened. She had sent her miracle child out into the world, and the world had destroyed her. As dawn broke over Cedar Rapids on December 20th, 1979, crime scene investigators worked under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, photographing every inch of the Buick Electra. What they found painted a picture of inexplicable rage and calculated preparation. Michelle's body was slumped across the front bench seat, still wearing her black dress and fur coat. The interior was awash in blood, on the steering wheel, the dashboard, the seats, the floor. But despite the violence, certain elements were deliberately undisturbed. Michelle's purse sat on the passenger seat, still containing the $186 she'd brought to pay for the coat. Her student ID, lipstick, and other personal items were untouched. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment revealed the horrific truth. Michelle had been stabbed 29 times. The wounds were concentrated on her face, neck, and chest, areas that suggested both rage and a desire to destroy her identity, her beauty, her very essence. The overkill is significant, the medical examiner noted in his report. This level of violence suggests a deeply personal attack. However, there's no evidence of completed sexual assault, though several wounds suggest the attack may have had sexual motivations. The physical evidence was maddeningly sparse. Detectives found impressions in the blood both inside and outside the car, footprints and handprints that revealed the killer had worn rubber gloves. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. The killer had come prepared, had planned this attack, had taken steps to avoid leaving fingerprints. But he had made one crucial mistake. In the fury of the assault, as Michelle fought for her life with every ounce of strength she possessed, She had injured her attacker. Mixed with her blood on the gear shift and on the back of her dress were traces of someone else's blood. In 1979, this evidence could only tell investigators one thing: the blood type. It was a common type, shared by millions of people. Without fingerprints, without witnesses, it was virtually useless. What the investigators didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Michelle, in her final terrifying moments, had ensured her killer would eventually be caught. She had marked him with his own blood, leaving a genetic signature that would wait patiently in an evidence locker for science to catch up. Detective Harvey Denninger, a 15-year veteran of the Cedar Rapids Police Department, had worked murders before, but the savagery of Michelle Martinko's death shook even his seasoned resolve. As he interviewed Michelle's friends and family, one name kept surfacing: Andy Settle. Andy was 19, just a year older than Michelle. They'd met 3 years earlier at the Skateland roller rink, a popular hangout where teenagers circled the polished wooden floor to disco music and top 40 hits. Their romance had been typical of high school: intense, all-consuming in the way only teenage love can be. They were inseparable for about 2 years, Michelle's friend Lisa told Detective Denninger. Andy was crazy about her. He'd write her these long letters, leave notes in her locker. We all thought they'd probably get married after graduation. But during the summer before her senior year, Michelle had made a decision. She wanted to experience her final year of high school without the constraints of a serious relationship. She wanted to attend football games with her girlfriends, maybe date casually, focus on choir and getting ready for college. She told him it wasn't that she didn't care about him, Lisa continued. She just needed space to figure out who she was without being someone's girlfriend. Andy didn't take it well. How didn't he take it well? Denninger pressed. He kept calling her, showing up places he knew she'd be. He'd quiz her friends about who she was talking to, if she was seeing anyone else. It wasn't like he was threatening or anything, but it was intense. Michelle felt bad about it, but she'd made up her mind. This was exactly the profile Denninger expected. The jilted ex-boyfriend, unable to accept rejection, driven by the toxic logic of, if I can't have her, no one can. When Andy was brought in for questioning, Denninger studied him carefully. He was a slight young man, soft-spoken, with eyes that were red-rimmed from crying. But Denninger had learned long ago that killers could cry too. "Where were you Wednesday night, Andy?" Denninger asked, his tone conversational, but his gaze sharp. "I was at the mall," Andy admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I went to buy Michelle a Christmas present. I know we weren't together anymore, but I still cared about her. I wanted to give her something nice." "And did you see Michelle at the mall?" Andy nodded. "Yeah, I ran into her by coincidence. We talked for a few minutes." Denninger leaned forward. "Security guard says he saw you two arguing." "What? No." Andy's voice rose for the first time. "We weren't arguing. I just told her I wished we could spend Christmas together, like we used to. She said no, that we'd moved on. It hurt, but we didn't argue. After that, I left and went straight home. Can anyone verify that? My mother. She was home when I got there." The polygraph tests were inconclusive. Andy, clearly distraught and anxious, couldn't achieve the calm baseline needed for accurate results. Based on the failed polygraphs, the police held him for the maximum 48 hours allowed without charges. Andy's mother, however, was adamant. "My son was home by 10:30 that night," she told police. "He came in, went to his room, and I heard him crying. He was heartbroken about Michelle, but he didn't hurt her. He couldn't have." Without physical evidence placing Andy at the scene, no fingerprints, no eyewitness putting him in Michelle's car, the police had to release him. But in the eyes of many, including the devastated Martinko family, Andy Seidel remained guilty. "He did this," Albert told Detective Denninger, his voice hard with certainty. "I can feel it. He killed my daughter because she wouldn't take him back. For Andy, the cloud of suspicion would hover over him for the next 4 decades, poisoning his relationships, haunting his days, making him a pariah in his own community. The police never officially cleared him, and whispers followed him wherever he went. But Andy Siddle hadn't killed Michelle Martinko. He was simply an unlucky young man who had loved the wrong girl at the wrong time and whose grief had been mistaken for guilt. As weeks turned into months, the investigation spiraled in frustrating directions. Detectives interviewed over 200 men, ex-boyfriends, classmates, mall employees, anyone who'd had even tangential contact with Michelle. Each interview ended the same way: cleared, no evidence. But the cruelest torture wasn't the lack of progress. It was the phone calls. It started about a month after Michelle's death. The Martinko phone would ring late at night. Janet, desperate for news from the police, would rush to answer it. "Hello?" Silence for a moment, then a voice, sometimes male, sometimes female, always distorted and mocking. "Mother? Mother, it's Michelle." Then laughter. Harsh, cruel laughter before the line went dead. The first time it happened, Janet collapsed. The calls kept coming, sometimes several times a week. Each one tore open the wound anew. Each one reminded the Martinko family that there were people in the world who found entertainment in their suffering. The police tried to trace the calls, but in 1979, without caller ID or modern technology, it was impossible. The best they could do was advise the Martinkos to change their number, but Janet refused. "What if Michelle's friends want to call?" she said, her logic fractured by grief. "What if someone has information and they can't reach us?" If this story is touching your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell so you never miss an update on cases where families finally find the justice they deserve. And please, share this video to help us raise awareness about cold cases that still need attention. The investigation's biggest hope came in 1981 when Stephen Morin was arrested in Texas. Morin was a transient serial killer, a drifter with a taste for young blonde women, and a drug habit that had erased large portions of his memory. When investigators asked if he'd ever been to Cedar Rapids, Morin's response chilled them. "I don't really remember if I killed anyone in Cedar Rapids, but I remember killing a lot of blonde girls." For weeks, Detective Denninger pursued the Morin angle with renewed vigor. Here, finally, was a suspect who fit the profile: violent, predatory, with a history of attacking women who looked like Michelle. But as they dug deeper, the evidence fell apart. Morin's timeline didn't place him in Iowa during December of 1979. No receipts, no witnesses, nothing concrete. When Morin was executed in 1985 for other murders, that door closed permanently. By the mid-1980s, the case file on Michelle Martinko had grown thick with dead ends and false hopes. The evidence, those precious drops of the killer's blood, sat in the evidence locker, scientifically useless with the technology of the time. Detective Harvey Denninger worked the case until his retirement in 2007, his obsession with finding Michelle's killer becoming a defining feature of his career. On his last day at the department, he sat at his desk, looking at Michelle's senior portrait, and wept. "I failed you," he whispered to the photograph. "I'm so sorry I couldn't catch him." Albert and Janet Martinko aged rapidly after their daughter's murder. The vibrant couple, who had once filled their home with laughter, became shadows, moving through life without truly living. Albert, consumed by rage and helplessness, threw himself into the investigation, calling the police constantly, following up on every rumor, every whisper. He became obsessed with Andy Seidel, certain that the young man had killed his daughter and gotten away with it. "That boy did it," Albert would say, his hands shaking. "I know he did. And he's walking free while my Michelle is in the ground." Janet's grief took a different form. She withdrew into herself, barely eating, rarely leaving the house. The phone calls from the sadistic pranksters had damaged something fundamental in her psyche. She began to suffer from severe anxiety and depression, convinced that she had failed in her most basic duty, to keep her miracle child safe. "I should have gone with her," she would repeat to anyone who would listen. "If I'd just gone to the mall with her, she'd still be alive. This is my fault." Their older daughter Janelle, now married to John Stonebreaker, did her best to care for her parents, but their grief was a wall she couldn't penetrate. She watched helplessly as her father's health deteriorated, his heart literally broken by the loss of Michelle. Albert Martinko died in 1995, 16 years after watching his miracle child leave for a choir banquet and never come home. He died without knowing who had killed his daughter, without ever seeing justice served. Janet, 14 years younger than her husband, followed him in 1998. In her final weeks, as cancer ravaged her body, she made Janelle promise one thing: "Never stop looking for the truth," Janet whispered, her voice weak. "Don't let people forget Michelle. Don't let her killer think he got away with it. Promise me, Janelle. Promise me you'll keep fighting." Janelle, tears streaming down her face, promised. Michelle's death killed them both, Janelle would later reflect. Dad died of a broken heart and rage he couldn't release. Mom died of guilt she should never have felt. They went to their graves without peace, without answers, without justice. I carried that weight for them. 27 years after Michelle Martinko's murder, Detective Doug Larson, head of the Cedar Rapids Cold Case Unit, pulled the dusty boxes from the evidence room. He'd heard the stories from the old-timers, the promising young girl, the savage killing, the investigation that went nowhere. As he sifted through fading photographs and yellowed reports, one detail caught his attention: blood evidence. Preserved in the evidence locker were scrapings from the Buick's gearshift and a cutting from Michelle's dress, both containing blood that wasn't hers. In 1979, this evidence could only reveal a blood type. But it was 2006, and forensic science had undergone a revolution. Larson sent the samples to the state crime lab with a simple request: extract DNA profile if possible. Weeks later, the results came back, and Larson felt his pulse quicken as he read the report. Not only had they successfully extracted a DNA profile from the mixed blood sample, but they'd isolated it from Michelle's blood. The profile belonged to a male. More importantly, it was complete enough to be run through CODIS, the national DNA database. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, investigators had a real lead. The killer had cut himself during the attack. Michelle, fighting for her life in those terrifying final moments, had forced her attacker to bleed, and he had left his genetic signature behind. Larson immediately submitted the profile to CODIS, his hopes high. Surely after all these years, the killer had been arrested for something else. Surely his DNA was in the system. The screen came back blank. No match. The disappointment was crushing, but Larson wasn't ready to give up. If the killer wasn't in CODIS, they'd have to cast a wider net. He began systematically collecting DNA from everyone who'd ever been associated with the case: friends, ex-boyfriends, family members, witnesses. Over the next several years, more than 100 men voluntarily provided samples. One by one, the results came back. Not a match, not a match, not a match. Then came Andy Siddle's turn. For 28 years, Andy had lived under suspicion. His name whispered in connection with Michelle's murder. He'd lost jobs, relationships, opportunities, all because he'd been the last boyfriend, the one who didn't take the breakup well. When Detective Larson contacted him, Andy didn't hesitate. "I'll give you whatever you need," Andy said. "I didn't kill Michelle. I loved her. If my DNA can prove I'm innocent, test me 100 times." The swab was sent to the lab. When the results came back, Larson sat in his office holding the report, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Andy Seidel was not a match. After nearly 3 decades of suspicion, science had finally exonerated him. But it also meant they were back to square one. The killer wasn't the jealous ex-boyfriend. He wasn't anyone on their radar. He was a ghost. By 2015, Larison had exhausted every avenue he could think of. The case had consumed 10 years of his life, and he had nothing to show for it. Mentally and emotionally drained, he made the painful decision to pass the case to a fresh set of eyes. The case went to Detective Matt Denninger. The assignment carried a weight beyond the typical cold case transfer. Matt was the son of Harvey Denninger, the detective who'd been first on the scene in 1979, who'd spent decades chasing Michelle's killer, who'd retired in 2007 without ever finding justice. Matt had grown up with this case. He'd heard his father talk about Michelle Martinko over countless dinners, seen the frustration and sadness in Harvey's eyes every time December 19th rolled around. Harvey had died in 2011, taking his obsession with the case to his grave. Now it fell to the son to finish what the father had started. In 2017, Matt Denninger sat in his office, staring at the DNA profile that had taunted investigators for over a decade. He had the killer's genetic code, literally a blueprint of the man's physical characteristics, but no name, no face, no identity. Then he heard about a Virginia company called Parabon Nanolabs that was doing something that sounded like science fiction: DNA phenotyping. Using genetic markers, they could predict what someone looked like: eye color, hair color, skin tone, even facial structure. Denninger sent them the profile. Weeks later, Parabon returned with 3 composite images: what the killer likely looked like at age 25, around the time of the murder, and age-progressed versions showing what he might look like at 45 and at his current age in 2017. The composites were released to the public with a press conference that generated significant media attention. Tips flooded in, dozens of them, pointing to men who resembled the images. But each lead evaporated upon investigation. The face was too generic, too common. It could have been half the middle-aged white men in Iowa. Denninger needed more. He needed a name. Then, in April 2018, news broke that would change everything. The Golden State Killer, a serial murderer and rapist who'd terrorized California for over a decade in the 1970s and 80s, had been caught using a revolutionary technique: genetic genealogy. Investigators had uploaded the killer's DNA to GEDmatch, a public genealogy website where people uploaded their DNA results from companies like Ancestry.com to find relatives. The Golden State Killer's DNA matched distant cousins who'd uploaded their information. From there, genealogists built family trees, working backwards and forwards until they identified a suspect. Denninger immediately contacted Parabon. "Can you do this for the Martinko case?" They could, and they did. The DNA profile was uploaded to GEDmatch in May 2018. Within weeks, they had a hit. Not to the killer himself, but to a woman named Brandy Jennings who lived in Vancouver, Washington. According to the genetic analysis, she was the killer's second cousin, once removed. Brandy Jennings had never heard of Michelle Martinko. She'd simply uploaded her DNA results to GEDmatch, hoping to learn more about her family history and maybe connect with distant relatives. She never imagined her genetic information would help catch a murderer. Working with genetic genealogists, Denninger began the painstaking process of building a family tree. They started with Brandy's great-grandparents, who were also the killer's great-grandparents, and worked down through the branches, identifying every descendant. It took months. Genealogists combed through census records, obituaries, marriage licenses, birth announcements. They tracked migrations, following family lines as they moved from one state to another. The tree grew sprawling and complex, with hundreds of names. But slowly, the branches narrowed. The genetic evidence pointed to a specific lineage, and within that lineage, to a family that had lived in Iowa in 1979. Specifically, to a family in Manchester, Iowa, a small town about 45 minutes northwest of Cedar Rapids. Three brothers, Donald Burns, Kenneth Burns, and Jerry Lynn Burns. On paper, they were pillars of the community, successful businessmen with families, mortgages, church attendance records, no criminal histories beyond minor traffic violations. They were the kinds of men who coached Little League and served on the city council. But science insisted that one of them had stabbed Michelle Martinko 29 times in a mall parking lot 39 years ago. Detective Matt Denninger knew he couldn't just knock on their doors and ask for DNA samples. If he tipped his hand and the guilty brother realized he was being investigated, he might flee or destroy evidence. Worse, Denninger didn't have probable cause for warrants, just a genetic genealogy analysis that, while scientifically sound, hadn't yet been tested extensively in court. He needed to obtain their DNA surreptitiously, and he needed to do it legally. He launched a surveillance operation. For weeks, undercover officers followed the three brothers through their daily routines, to work, to restaurants, to the grocery store, waiting for the right moment. Donald Burns was the first to unwittingly provide evidence. Officers waiting until trash day, then retrieved items from his garbage can left at the curb. A used toothbrush and a drinking glass were carefully bagged and sent to the lab. Result: not a match. Donald was excluded. Kenneth Burns was followed to a local diner. After he finished his meal and left, detectives swooped in and retrieved the straw he'd used in his iced tea. Result: not a match. Kenneth was excluded. That left Jerry Lynn Burns, age 64, owner of a powder coating business in Manchester. On a Thursday afternoon, officers followed him to a Pizza Ranch restaurant. They watched through the window as he ordered, ate, and drank from a straw. When he left, they went in immediately. "Excuse me," Detective Denninger said to the server, showing his badge. "The man who just left. I need that straw he used. Don't touch it. Use gloves." The server, eyes wide with surprise, carefully placed the straw in the evidence bag Denninger provided. The straw was rushed to the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation lab. The DNA was extracted and analyzed. Then it was run against the profile from Michelle Martinko's car. When the results came back, Matt Denninger sat alone in his office staring at the report. His hands were shaking. Perfect match. The probability of the DNA belonging to anyone other than Jerry Lynn Burns: 1 in 100 billion. There were only 7 billion people on Earth. After 39 years, Michelle Martinko's killer finally had a name and a face. And, remarkably, he'd been living a normal life just 45 minutes away from where he'd committed murder, raising a family, running a business, attending church, coaching youth sports. He'd hidden in plain sight for nearly 4 decades, a monster who looked like everyone's neighbor. Detective Matt Denninger chose the date deliberately. Exactly 39 years to the day after Michelle Martinko bled to death in a mall parking lot, he drove to Manchester, Iowa, with a warrant and a team of investigators. They arrived at Burns Powder Coating, a successful business Jerry had built over the decades. The building was modest but well-maintained, with a sign out front bearing the Burns family name. Jerry Lynn Burns sat behind his office desk when Denninger entered, flanked by other detectives. At 64, Burns had aged into a distinguished-looking man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked like what he was, a successful small-town businessman, a grandfather, a pillar of the community. He also looked utterly calm. Mr. Burns, I'm Detective Matt Denninger with the Cedar Rapids Police Department. We need to ask you some questions about an incident from 1979. Burns leaned back in his chair, pulling a cigarette from his pocket with practiced ease. Okay. Do you know a woman named Michelle Martinko? No. The answer came quickly, without hesitation. Have you ever been to Westdale Mall in Cedar Rapids? Sure, I've been there. Burns lit his cigarette, exhaling slowly. Lots of times over the years. Denninger slid a photograph across the desk. Michelle's senior portrait, that bright smile frozen forever at 18. This is Michelle Martinko. She was murdered at Westdale Mall on December 19, 1979. It's one of the most famous cases in Iowa. Surely you've heard of it. Burns glanced at the photo with no visible emotion. I might have heard something about it. Think carefully, Jerry. December 19, 1979. That was 39 years ago today. You might have been at the mall buying Christmas gifts for your family. You might have seen this girl. Any memory coming back? Burns took another drag on his cigarette, his eyes never leaving Denninger's face. I know what I'm supposed to say, he replied, his voice flat. Don't put words in my mouth. Denninger leaned forward. The casual conversation was over. The reality is, Jerry, we have your DNA at the crime scene. We know you were there. We know you were in that car with Michelle Martinko. So tell me, how did your DNA get there? For the first time, something flickered in Burns's eyes. Not fear exactly, but calculation. He took his time responding, grinding out his cigarette in an ashtray. I'm a businessman, Burns said finally. I know the law. My attorney will answer that question. Test the DNA, he added, crossing his arms. Just test it. We did test it, Jerry. It's a perfect match. 1 in 100 billion odds. There are only 7 billion people on the planet. The math doesn't lie. Test it again, Burns repeated like a mantra. Test the DNA. Denninger placed the warrant for a confirmatory buccal swab on the desk. Burns read it carefully, his businessman's mind parsing every word, looking for an out that didn't exist. The swab was taken. It would, of course, confirm what the straw had already proven. Jerry Lynn Burns was arrested that day, exactly 39 years after he'd murdered Michelle Martinko. As he was led out in handcuffs past employees who stared in shock, Burns maintained that same eerie calm. No protests of innocence, no emotional outbursts, no tears. Just the blank, controlled face of a man who'd been living a lie for 4 decades and had finally been caught. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they began digging into Jerry Burns's life, trying to understand how a man who by all appearances was normal could commit such savage violence. What they found was disturbing. A search of Burns's computer history from 2018 revealed a pattern of searches that chilled investigators. Blonde molested, sex with freshly dead person, violent pornography blonde women. The prosecution wanted to introduce this evidence at trial, arguing it showed Burns's sexual proclivities and established motive. The defense fought hard against it, and Judge Fay Hoover Grind ultimately ruled in their favor. Computer searches from 2018 could not legally prove Burns's state of mind in 1979. The evidence was inadmissible, but it gave investigators insight into what they were dealing with. Burns's attack on Michelle hadn't been random. It had been sexually motivated, driven by fantasies of domination and violence against young blonde women, fantasies that apparently persisted throughout his life. Even more chilling was what cellmate Michael Allison would later testify to. Allison had shared a cell with Burns while he awaited trial, and during those months, Burns had let his guard down in moments. We were playing cards one day, Allison would later tell the court. I was winning and Jerry was getting frustrated. He looked at me and said, "If you keep beating me, I'm going to have to take you to the mall." The statement hung in the courtroom air. It wasn't a confession, but it was something darker. Burns using the memory of Michelle's murder as a weapon, as a threat, as something he had ownership of. Did you ask him directly if he killed Michelle Martinko? The prosecutor asked. I did, Allison replied. I said, Jerry, did you do it? He just looked at me and said, I can't talk about that. Perhaps most revealing was another statement Allison attributed to Burns. "Anyway, I'm the winner here. I had more than 40 years to build my career, start a family, and live my life without ever being caught." If true, it showed a man without remorse, someone who viewed evading justice as a personal victory rather than a moral failure. The Lynn County Courthouse was packed for the trial of Jerry Lynn Burns. It had been 40 years since Michelle Martinko's murder, and the community hadn't forgotten. Those who remembered that terrible December had grown gray. Some of Michelle's high school classmates attended every day of the trial, wanting to finally see justice for their friend. Janelle Martinko Stonebreaker sat in the front row with her husband John, her face a mask of controlled emotion. Her parents were gone, but she was there to represent them, to be Michelle's voice. First Assistant Lynn County Attorney Nick Maybanks presented a case built almost entirely on science. There were no eyewitnesses placing Burns at the scene. The circumstantial evidence was thin, but the DNA was irrefutable. Criminalist Paul Bush from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation took the stand, explaining the DNA evidence in clear, understandable terms. "The profile obtained from the blood on Michelle Martinko's dress," Bush testified, "is consistent with the known DNA profile of Jerry Lynn Burns." To drive the point home, the prosecution called statistical analyst Michael Schmidt. He explained to the jury what the match meant in practical terms. "The probability of finding this DNA profile in a random individual unrelated to the defendant," Schmidt stated, looking directly at the jurors, "is less than 1 in 100 billion. To put that in perspective, there are approximately 7 billion people on Earth. This means it's more likely that every person on the planet is Jerry Burns than it is that this DNA belongs to someone else." The defense, led by attorney Leon Spies, faced a seemingly impossible task, explaining away a perfect DNA match. Their strategy centered on the concept of secondary transfer, the idea that DNA could be transferred from person to person or object to object without direct contact. "Is it possible," Spies asked the forensic experts during cross-examination, "that Mr. Burns touched a surface at the mall, say, a door handle, and the real killer later touched that same surface, transferring Mr. Burns's DNA to their hands, which was then transferred to the victim during the attack?" The experts acknowledged it was theoretically possible, but highly improbable given the nature of the evidence. "This wasn't skin cells on a door handle," Maybanks countered during a rebuttal. "This was blood. Blood mixed with the victim's blood on the gear shift she was struggling to use, on the dress she was wearing while fighting for her life. Blood from cuts sustained during a violent attack. That isn't secondary transfer. That is primary contact during the commission of murder." Spies also suggested that because Burns had once worked at a Buick dealership years before, his DNA might have been in the Martinko family car all along, just waiting to be discovered. The prosecution tore this theory apart. "The Buick Electra was purchased in 1972, Maybanks pointed out. "Mr. Burns worked at the dealership briefly in the early 1970s. Are we to believe his blood, not skin cells, not hair, but blood, somehow remained preserved in that car for 7 years undetected, only to conveniently mix with the victim's blood during her murder? That defies both logic and science." The most damning testimony came from Michael Allison, Burns's former cellmate. His account of Burns's statements, the card game threat, the claim of being the winner, the refusal to directly deny involvement, painted a picture of a man who was not confused or wrongly accused, but rather cold and calculating. Throughout the trial, Jerry Burns sat motionless at the defense table, his face betraying no emotion. He never took the stand in his own defense. His family, wife, children, grandchildren, attended sporadically, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. They couldn't reconcile the man they knew with the monster described in testimony. On February 24, 2020, after just 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Judge Fay Hoover Grind called the court to order. Would the defendant please rise? Jerry Lynn Burns stood, flanked by his attorneys. For the first time, his composure seemed to crack slightly, his jaw tightening. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman who'd taken copious notes throughout the trial, handed the verdict form to the bailiff. Judge Grind read it silently, her face revealing nothing, then read aloud, "We, the jury, find the defendant Jerry Lynn Burns guilty of murder in the first degree." The courtroom erupted. Janelle Stonebreaker collapsed against her husband, sobbing, not tears of sadness but of release. After 40 years, justice had finally arrived. Burns showed no reaction, no tears, no protests. He simply stood there, the same blank expression he'd worn throughout the trial, as if the verdict had happened to someone else. At sentencing, Judge Grind addressed Burns directly. "Mr. Burns, on December 19, 1979, you took the life of Michelle Martinko, an 18-year-old girl with her entire life ahead of her. You robbed her of her future, of love, of family, of every dream she had. You devastated her parents, who died without ever knowing justice. You traumatized a community, and for 39 years, you lived freely while Michelle's family suffered. The law requires that I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But I want you to know that even if I had discretion, that is exactly the sentence you deserve. You will die in prison, Mr. Burns, just as Michelle Martinko died in that parking lot. The difference is she was innocent." Jerry Lynn Burns was led away in shackles. He would spend the rest of his days in the Iowa State Penitentiary in Fort Madison, a 64-year-old man facing the reality that he would never again be free. Some unanswered questions still linger, though. Even with Burns convicted, shadows lingered. During his initial interrogation, before invoking his right to an attorney, Burns had made a strange, unprompted reference to Jody Huizentruitt, a Mason City news anchor who disappeared in 1995 under suspicious circumstances. Her case remains unsolved. "Why would you bring up Jody Huizentruitt?" Denninger had asked, puzzled by the non sequitur. Burns had just shrugged, offering no explanation. It left investigators wondering, was Michelle his only victim, or simply the only one he was caught for? There was also the strange case of Burns's cousin, Brian Burns, who disappeared in 2013. Brian's remains were eventually found, but the circumstances were murky. Some in law enforcement couldn't help but wonder if Jerry had been involved, though no evidence ever connected him to Brian's disappearance. Burns has never spoken about the murder. He's never explained why he targeted Michelle specifically, whether he'd stalked her beforehand, or if she was simply a victim of terrible chance. He's never shown remorse, never apologized to the family, never given them the closure that comes with understanding. And so Michelle Martinko's murder, while solved, retains some of its mystery. The who has been answered, but the why remains locked in the mind of a man who has chosen silence. For Janelle Martinko Stonebreaker, now in her 60s, the conviction brought a complex mixture of emotions. "Relief," she said in an interview after the trial. "Finally, relief. But also grief for what my parents missed. They died believing justice would never come. They died with broken hearts, consumed by this case. I wish more than anything they could have been here to see him convicted, to know that Michelle didn't die in vain." She visits Michelle's grave regularly, a modest headstone in a Cedar Rapids cemetery. After the conviction, she brought flowers and sat beside the grave, telling her sister the news their parents had died waiting to hear. "We got him, Michelle," she whispered, her fingers tracing her sister's name carved in stone. It took 41 years, but we got him. The case changed cold case investigation in Iowa and beyond. It demonstrated the power of genetic genealogy, opening the door for dozens of other cold cases to be re-examined with new tools. Michelle's death, while tragic, helped pave the way for other families to find justice. Detective Matt Denninger, who finished what his father started, keeps Michelle's photo on his desk. He never met her. She died 7 years before he was born, but he feels connected to her in a profound way. My dad carried this case his entire career, Matt reflected. He talked about Michelle at the dinner table, lost sleep over her, aged under the weight of not being able to solve it. When I was assigned the case, I felt like I was being given a sacred trust. I was going to find her killer for my dad, for the Martinkos, but most of all, for Michelle herself. She deserved justice. She deserved to be remembered as more than just a victim. And she is remembered, not just as the girl who was murdered in a mall parking lot, but as the vibrant, talented, humble young woman who loved music and fashion and had her whole life ahead of her, as the miracle baby who completed her family, as the fighter who, in her final moments, marked her killer with his own blood and left the evidence that would eventually bring him to justice. Jerry Lynn Burns will die in prison. He will never again see a sunset as a free man, never again attend a family celebration, never again move through the world pretending to be normal. His legacy is one of violence and cowardice, of a predator who preyed on the innocent. Michelle Martinko's legacy is different. Her case demonstrated that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still arrive. That forensic science can give voice to victims long after they're gone. That families who refuse to give up, who keep pushing for answers, can eventually find them. On December 19th each year, Janelle returns to Michelle's grave with fresh flowers. She tells her sister about her life, about her grandchildren Michelle never got to meet, about the world that has changed so much since 1979, and she makes the same promise her mother asked of her. We'll never forget you, Michelle. We'll never let the world forget you. Thank you so much for watching and being part of our community. This case reminds us that cold cases are never truly cold as long as people continue to fight for justice. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update. And please share this video to help us create awareness about other unsolved cases that still need attention. Every share could be the one that brings a new tip, a new lead, or helps another family find the closure they desperately need. Until next time, stay safe, hold your loved ones close, and never stop believing in justice.